message that was in that was worth clapping for. So please, congregation, do not feel restricted in your clapping. It is a very easy thing to do, and let's just practice for a second. All right? And how many of you went Saturday night to the concert? Ooh. There was a very nice concert that, of course, I missed, but we need to support community events, and when we're out there, we can practice our clapping. Okay? So next time we've got one of those, let's make sure if we get to that theater, thank you, October 5th, and we'll support whatever that's going on. We want God to breathe life into our community. Guess what? We're the life. Right? So we can't just expect God to do it like he did with Ezekiel, because he is doing things in a new way now. He's put his breath, his spirit into us, and as we infiltrate the community in all different kinds of ways and at times, we are the breath of life. Okay? So join me October 5th for the next one. Okay. Last week, our discussion of how the church and the culture have become so disconnected from each other, and the role of the church to be the voice of the prophet. And we talked about last week the American disdain for royalty and how that makes it difficult for us to share the Christian faith, because at its core, the Christian faith is about bending the knee to a king. All right? So there's not some human king that we're talking about up here, like King George III or one of the 19 Louis of France. Not one of those kings, but the king of all creation. The Christian faith is about announcing God's reign through Jesus Christ as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Jesus is the anointed one. And furthermore, God has determined that at some point in human history, every knee would bow to Jesus, and every tongue would confess that he is the Lord of all. For the time being, of course, everyone has the freedom to choose whether or not they want to bend the knee or confess. But at some point, God has ordained that every knee will bow. That's the reality. And that message is a really difficult one for Americans. And we have to include ourselves in that too, as American Christians. We like voting on stuff. Right? Even as a church, this is why we have a congregational model of governance where we get to vote on every decision. We want to be able to evaluate and discuss it. It's why we like checks and balances. That's why we have a deacon board, to make sure that one person doesn't assume all power and begin making all decisions. It spreads it out some. We like leaders who look like us and think like us and deal with the same kind of stuff in life that we deal with. And all that was actually part of that pastoral search process that you all went through last spring. We are as democratic in our thinking as the rest of our culture. And we like to call ourselves American Baptists. Emphasis on American in that context. So we struggle with the idea of royalty just as much as everyone else in our culture. But Jesus, the Bible tells us, is royalty. Right? He's the Son of God, the Creator. He wants to be our King, and as King, Jesus is not looking for our vote. He's not looking for some balance in authority. He's not looking for just a 4-year term. He wants to be our King, our Master, our Lord, and that means sharing the gospel is a challenge. Okay, that was last week, right? If you didn't get all of that, please go back and listen to it. You ought to check out the website. Brandon and I have been working on a refresh for it, and you can now take a look at the sermons each week and also listen to them pretty easily. This week, I want to explore one of Jesus' parables. A parable that involves a king, just like last week, and the king's servants, and discuss how our reading of it reveals another disconnect with our culture. Okay, so it contains some truth I think is really important. It's called the wedding feast in my Bible. It's in Matthew chapter 22. So if you have the Bible, please turn to that. Parable of the wedding feast, Matthew chapter 22. And I'm going to read the first 10 verses. Okay? Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. And again he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention, and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. And then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads. Invite them to the wedding feast, as many as you can find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. The wedding hall was filled with guests. Okay, we'll stop right there. Let's identify for a moment the main characters of this story. Okay? And you go ahead and just speak them out. The king, who does that role represent in our lives? The king. In the story. God the Father. Right? Everyone say God the Father. Yes. And his son that's getting married is who? Jesus. Good. And who is Jesus marrying? His bride. Who is his bride? All right, so how many of you, when you were growing up, ever did a sword drill? All right, we're going to do a little sword drill. And if you would like to participate in the sword drill is a little contest. I give you a reference, and whoever gets it first and is able to start reading, you stand up and you get a prize. All right, this is the answer to the question of who is his bride, okay? So everybody ready? Who's participating? I got the Bartletts here. Okay, a few. No, phones don't count. We're actually looking at the phone. All right, you ready? Swords up. Only if you've done this way back when would you know what that means. Yeah. All right, the reference is Revelation 21, 1 to 2. Go. Sandy, please take a prize. That was incredibly fast. So did you hear what the answer was? Who is the bride? No, what did Sandy just read? The holy city, the New Jerusalem, is the bride. Now that's interesting, okay? We'll talk about that another week. But that's the answer to this right now. Who's the bride? Is the New Jerusalem. Servants who are sent out with the invitations. Who does that represent? Yeah, the church. There we go. The church of the servants. In this parable, the bride is New Jerusalem. Okay? And who are the first set of guest invites sent to? The Jews. Correct? And the Jews didn't care to come to the party. And so who are the troops that the king sent to bring judgment on the first set of guests? Who are the troops? I will give you a hint. They are not human. Angels. And now for one more prize, for someone who answered this question correctly. When did that judgment on the Jews occur? What was the date? My wife says 70 AD. She's correct. Did you say it?
I did say it.
All right. What color do you want, Beth?
No, I want her to have it. We'll make it.
What color, Beth? I have purple, brown, green, orange, and red.
Purple.
Okay.
Woo! Oh my word.
70 AD is a date that you need to know, and we'll talk about it more in another week Okay, according to this parable, who are the second batch of invites going out to? The Gentiles. Good. So the Jews got the first batch of invites. The Gentiles got the second batch of invites. And there were some on the main roads. There were some on the side roads. Some were good, it says. Some were not so good. And in Luke's version of this same parable, the king tells the servants to go to the streets and the lanes of the city, bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Okay, so and this was actually how the Jews thought about the Gentiles, spiritually speaking. The Gentiles were blind, lame, naked, and crippled. They didn't know their right hand from their left hand, spiritually speaking. Okay, so we have all the roles filled out in this parable. God is the king. God the Father is the king. Jesus is the son who's getting married. The New Jerusalem is his bride. The followers of Jesus are his servants. And receiving the invitations are both Jews and Gentiles, basically everyone in the world. Everybody got that? Okay. So, let's focus on the role of the servants. The role of the servants. Okay? What was the task the king gave them? Anyone? To deliver the invitations, right? Yeah. Why did the king want them to deliver the invitations? What does it say in that text? Verse 10, into verse 10. What was the king's intention there? What did he want? He wanted to be full, right? He wanted the wedding hall to be full. And we understand, right? A wedding is such a big event. I mean, you want every seat filled if at all possible. The more people, there's the more excitement, the more cheering, the more joy that is shared. Of course, if you're paying for the wedding, perhaps you're not so excited about every seat being filled, especially if it means paying for the catered plates in the reception. That can be really costly. But if you have the money, and in this case the king has the money, you don't want empty seats. You want every seat filled for this wonderful experience. Okay? There's something really energizing about a full house. When 2 or 3 are gathered and Jesus is in their midst, that's great, right? But when 20 or 30 are gathered, there's something unique about that. We had 20 or 30 gathered here on Friday night with the K4J launch. The youth group was here. We had a good group. And then Saturday morning, the men's breakfast, we had about 20, right? So that's good. That's better than 2 or 3, right, Tim? You would have felt bad if the men's breakfast, all those pancakes would have gone just 2 or 3 of us. Yeah, okay. But 20 or 30 is better. Well, 200 to 300 feels even completely different than that. When you have 200 or 300 in a place, now there's some real kind of excitement in the air. You can just kind of feel it, a bigger group. And if you get to 2,000 to 3,000, if you've ever been to a big conference, for instance, you go to 2,000 to 3,000, it's just a completely different experience. The group itself is the energy. The group itself is the announcement that something amazing is happening. So the king wants a full house for the wedding feast. And it was up to the servants to get the invites out. And if one group of people didn't respond positively to the invitations, the servants were directed to go out to another group, and then another group, until they had the wedding hall completely filled. The king was demanding that. The servants needed to deliver. That was their role, right? To deliver the invitation. And then as servants, we can speculate that once they got all the invitations out and they came back, what do you think the servants then did at the wedding feast? Served. It's not a trick question. They would have served the guests, and then as servants, when the feast was over, what would they do? Clean up, right. Okay, so they would deliver the invitations, serve the guests, and clean up. Okay, so everyone's clear about the roles. Let's continue reading in Matthew 22, starting at verse 11. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garments. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. And then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, few are chosen." Okay, so the end of the parable is about whom? The king and some guy who didn't dress properly. Yeah, we're not exactly sure maybe what that signifies at this moment. Why was the king so angry at this man? have this guest bound and then throw out, and because this parable uses these symbols of outer darkness and the weeping of gnashing of teeth, we understand that judgment had just occurred. Because this is the way judgment is portrayed often in Scripture. So this parable clearly indicates a couple of things about the king that's really important. First of all, the king wants the wedding hall filled. He wants every seat taken. And it's for his son's glory, his joy, his satisfaction. The hall is packed when his son's bride walks down the aisle. That's the first thing we know. The second thing we know is the king directs his servants to hand out all the invites. The king doesn't want to do that work. The king has servants to do the invitations and keep handing them out until the wedding hall is full. And then third, the king reserves the right to decide if any given guest is dressed appropriately or not. Right? And if they're not, the king reserves the right to kick them out. Right? Okay, so just a couple questions to clarify. Who decides to send out the invitations? The king. All right, good. Who delivers the invitation? Servants. Who's being honored at the wedding? The son. Who decides if the wedding guests are dressed appropriately? The king. Who decides whether an invited guest gets to stay or not? The king. So to be clear, it's the servant's role to deliver the invitations. Is it the servant's role to decide who gets in or stays out? No, that's not their role. That's the king's role, right? The role of the servant is to do what? Deliver the invitation, serve the guests, clean up when it's done. Right? Deliver invitations, serve the guests, clean up when it's done. Everybody say that with me. Deliver the invitations, serve the guests, clean up when it's done. Let's try it one more time. Deliver the invitations, serve the guests, clean up when it's done. Right? Do you see any space in there for judging the guests? Do you see any indication that the king would appreciate some help deciding who gets to stay and who does not get to stay? Does the king ask for the servant's opinion on how the guests are dressed? No. Why? It's not the servant's role, right? It's not their place. It's not their responsibility. It's not their mandate. It's not their job. It's not their job description, right? That's the king's job. Do you think the servants have an opinion about the guests that are present? Well, of course. Right? It would be impossible not to have an opinion about them. I mean, who invited the bum who wasn't dressed appropriately? I'm sure, that servant had an opinion about that guy. Right? But did that stop the servant from inviting him? No. Right? The servant's job was to pass out the invites so the seat was full. The king wanted the wedding hall filled. So when the servants were canvassing the highways and the byways and the alleyways and beating the hedges and searching the gutters for anyone alive to give an invitation to, do you think they had an opinion about many of those people? Of course they did. Right? It'd be impossible not to. But is there any indication in this parable that the king cared about the servant's opinion? That's a hard one. The king reserves the right to decide who's worthy and who's not, who gets to stay and who's not, who's dressed appropriately and who's not. The servant's job is to pass out invites, serve the guests, and clean up when it's over. See, forgetting our role is a big reason why the church and our culture have become so lost from each other. Forgetting what our task actually is a big reason why we are no longer walking hand in hand. It's why we've lost contact with each other. It's why we have become so separated, so distant from each other, so antagonistic toward each other. It's a big reason why culture no longer asks for our advice or even listens to our voice. Because, by and large, we forgot our role. At some point in American church history, the church decided it was a servant's role to judge, to carefully select who gets the invite and who does not, to determine who receives forgiveness and who does not. The worst of our history as Christians is the years when the church and the state was the rule, they were wed together, right? The church was the ruling power in the land. Beginning with Charlemagne in 800 AD, the church and state were wed together. And the church understood themselves not just to be servants passing out the invites, but the guard at the door, even the king making all the servants do their bidding. And even though the years of church and state being wed together in one office, like for instance as a Holy Roman Emperor, even though that is over, the confusion about our role remains. The church has struggled to simply fulfill the task given to her, to pass out the invites, to serve the guests, and then to clean up. In my lifetime alone, I have heard churches decide who is acceptable to God or not, based on whether or not they worked on Sunday, whether they were Sabbath breakers, whether or not they were committed to tithing, whether or not they were committed to capitalism, or whether or not they believed in America. Believe it or not, I attended a church once that thought there was no way a person could be acceptable to God if they didn't believe in America, because America was God's nation. In my lifetime, I've experienced churches deciding who is acceptable or not to God based on whether or not they drank alcohol, whether or not they smoked, whether or not they were able-bodied or not, or just cursed, whether or not they drank alcohol right, or any of the other vices, whether or not they had addictions, whether or not they had cleaned up enough, whether they had taken those earrings out of their ears if they were male, or had they worn the proper dress if they were female. Now, I've heard churches decide who's acceptable or not to God based on whether or not a person had tattoos, whether or not they smoked, whether they remained morally pure until marriage, whether or not they were still in their first marriage, whether or not they had married someone outside their own ethnic group, more recently, whether or not they clearly fit the male-female binary, or intend on ever having children like normal people do. Believe it or not, the church over the last 100 years have made all those decisions, acting as if they're the guard at the door of the wedding hall, not the servant just passing out the invites. They try to decide who should be in and who should not be in. And yet that's not our role, right? It's not the role of servants. Servants are to deliver the good news. The son is getting married and everyone is invited. No more than that. Their role is not to put conditions on each invitation. The king gets to decide who's dressed appropriately, who's not the servants. There's only one judge, not many judges. Any precondition that we place on those invites is us overstepping our role. Our culture instinctively knows this, by the way, because every condition we put on invites reveals our own hypocrisy. Now, I've always heard that hypocrisy was practicing what you preach, or not practicing what you preach, or not living the way you tell others to live. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's also hypocrisy to forget who you are and what your role is. To act like you're the king and you're nothing more than a servant. It reminds me in a way, and you can pick this picture up there, you guys, of Downton Abbey. How many of you have seen this series? It's a PBS show that's really interesting because it has this amazing mansion, and there's this family living upstairs that is in great finery and very, elegance, and they are, upper class and this kind of thing. And the servants are all downstairs serving the family and making sure the family upstairs has everything they need. And occasionally, in the storyline, one of the servants will forget their place. Or in the case of one episode, a maid gets caught trying on a piece of clothing from one of the family upstairs because she thought the family was gone, and she got caught, and then she loses her job because of that. She lost her job because she forgot her place. Right? She forgot the role for which she had been hired, and so she overstepped the lines. And most of us empathize with the maid in this scenario because the family is, they're just human like all the servants downstairs. Right? They might be a little more rich, but they're not anything special. They're not more valuable to God. They might be more valuable in society, but they're not more valuable to God. And so I think probably a lot of us kind of empathize with the servants in that show. But in the parable we're studying today, the family upstairs is actually not at all actually divine. Those of us who are downstairs, who are here to serve, I hate to break it to you, we are not divine. There's just a clear distinction. Now in Downton Abbey, it's possible for a servant to marry someone upstairs and then all of a sudden transfer, and they suddenly are this, like royalty. Does anybody remember the first season? Which one was this? The chauffeur, yeah, Branson, right? The chauffeur. And he managed to woo the younger daughter of the family living upstairs, and suddenly he's upstairs. Right? Yeah, there's no way that's going to happen in our parables scenario, right? There is divinity, and then there's humanity. And God gives us a piece of himself, but that's not the same thing as you becoming God. Right? Instead, we always should remember who we were when we got the invitation ourselves. Who were we? If we remember honestly, none of us were addressed appropriately for the wedding, right? You remember when you received the invitation? Isaiah 64:6 says, all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. We all shrivel up like a leaf, and like the wind, our sins sweep us away. Or Isaiah 53:6, all we like sheep have gone astray, each of us to his own way. The Lord lay on him the iniquity of us all. Or 1 Timothy 5:24, the sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. 1 John 2:2, Jesus is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also the sins of the whole world. You see, as servants, we are in no position to judge anyone because we ourselves are only at the wedding feast because of pure grace. Right? We're only there because someone invited us. We didn't earn it. We weren't dressed well enough to attend, frankly. None of us had fulfilled every precondition. None of us had it all together. And our culture knows that. Our culture knows that. Right? Our culture knows that we are like an emperor with no clothes on. So the emperor might act as if he's clothed in great finery. But our culture can see that we're not. I mean, they know us, right? They know us at work. They know us at school. They know us, they can hear us at home. They can see us driving. I mean, our culture is not fooled by our words. Right? Our culture hears the church talking about who is acceptable to God and who is not, who's an abomination to God and who is not, and we think we have the right to do so. Actually, we don't. We don't. Unless you are perhaps John the Baptist or one of those prophets that got called, filled with the Spirit in the womb, and you got called, and God puts his words in your mouth that you can say, thus says the Lord, it's this way. Unless you're one of those, all you're supposed to be doing is passing out invites. It's not our job to judge anyone. It's not our job to talk about prerequisites or preconditions of how you have to be before you come to the wedding feast. Just pass out the invites. Right? Serve the guests when they come. And then clean up afterwards. But that's our role. I mean, think about how Jesus, the Son, took each of us in from whatever gutter he found us in, and he clothed us with some of his own clothes. Right? So that we would be dressed appropriately. We didn't buy those clothes that we're wearing for the wedding feast. We didn't luck out and find them. We had nothing when he found us, right? You remember? You and I should have been kicked out of the wedding party. You remember that? We weren't dressed properly. But the Son took us in love and pure grace, gave us some of his own clothes from his own wardrobe. Scriptures say robed in his own righteousness. He put those on us so that we would be dressed properly. And the work he has given us to do now is to pass out the invites, serve the guests, and clean up ourselves. And you know what else? He wants us to enjoy the wedding. Yeah, we actually have the best seats in the house. We get to see what God has been doing here on earth, and we'll get to see what God is going to do in heaven. Lucy and I once wanted to see the band U2. This is back in their heyday. This is back when we were in college. And U2 was like the biggest thing around. They were coming to Los Angeles. Neither of us had any money. And so we thought, how can we get in to watch them? They were actually coming with the Amnesty International concert, which was a whole bunch of artists, but they were the headliners. And so we did the smartest thing you could do. We signed up to be security. We had the best seat in the house. We could never have afforded to go to that concert. The tickets were hundreds of dollars. I got in the first section wearing some orange vest. And they told me I was supposed to spend the whole concert facing the other direction. Did I do that? No way. I mean, about halfway through the concert, I just slipped off the orange vest, tossed it, and I joined the mosh pit. And we were right there. Did I care about the $40 I didn't earn? No. I got to see the concert for free. The thing about being a servant in the kingdom at the wedding feast is you have the best in the house. It didn't cost you anything, honestly. Jesus is the one who gave you the clothes that you're wearing. You're dressed appropriately because it came out of his closet. And we have the best seat in the house. So honestly, the church needs to stop worrying about the king's job and just do it all. The king will follow through. Don't have to worry about the king doing his job. The king's judgment will occur. You don't have to worry about that. We all have opinions about some of the people who have been invited. No problem. Have your opinions, just, yeah, you know. It's wiser just to keep it to yourself. That's the role of the servant. The king will decide who's dressed properly, so let the king be king, and everything else will turn out just right. Okay? Let's pray. Jesus, we allow ourselves to be really honest. And we know we have no right claiming to be in your household. We have nothing to offer you. And you gave us a chance. You gave us an opportunity. You welcomed us in and clothed us in your own righteousness. For that, we are deeply grateful. And I commit myself this week to fulfill the role of your servant. I want to be an inviter. And not just any inviter, but one that goes after anyone who has breath, regardless of where I find them, regardless of how they happen to be dressed at that moment, because I want the wedding hall to be filled, knowing that it will bring honor to you and your name. I commit myself to allowing the king to be the judge. I commit to keeping my opinions about other people to myself this week, resisting the urge to reveal myself as a hypocrite. May your joy be our joy.